Subject: Representative Julio Cortés. Break the silence on immigrant and workers' rights. You're being Nazis. Message: Dear Representative Cortés, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to you not only as a constituent, but also as someone deeply invested in the rights and dignity of both immigrant communities and American workers. While I appreciate your passion for uplifting immigrant voices, your recent remarks about protecting immigrant communities in Washington state ring hollow when juxtaposed with your silence on critical issues that directly affect immigrants and workers in our state and beyond. You said,
Hola, buenos días, mi gente.
Buenos días.
¿Cómo están? ¿Bien? ¿Con ganas? Va, órale pues. I'm State Representative Julio Cortés from the 38th Legislative District, and honestly, it's an honor to be among so many colleagues who share a united vision to uplift and protect our immigrant communities. My parents are Mexican immigrants. Guadalajara and Morelos. I'm a Mexican immigrant. From Mexico City, Chilango. So my parents worked as immigrant farm workers in the fields of Wabato and Yakima, picking everything from apples, pears, cherries. So this is very, very personal to me. My colleagues in the legislature and I are ready to work with other electeds to make sure that we are ready to protect our immigrant communities right here in Washington state. We are identifying gaps between state and federal immigrant supports as we speak, and we are and will continue to meet face-to-face with our immigrant populations and communities to make sure that we are hearing directly from them, to make sure that we know as a legislature, as their representatives, because we represent them as well, what to do to support those communities. Through intergovernment collaboration, the door to federal overreach and marginalization will remain closed. Yes. We've been at these crossroads in history before, so I can assure you, and I want you all to hear this, we will rise to meet this moment again. It's who we are. It's what Washington State is. From passing the Keep Washington Working Act in 2019 to securing millions in funding for immigrant relief, we will stand firm against any incursion. Governor Ferguson, this executive order sends a clear message, and I truly hope that our federal partners and our neighbors hear us. We will not be silent. As Dolores Huerta once said, walk the street with us into history and get off that sidewalk.
That's
Gracias y echarle ganas.
We will not be silent. Yet, I have written to you repeatedly to educate you and your colleagues about two glaring injustices: the violations of American citizens' human rights in the immigration system and the systematic dismantling of workers' compensation protections. Your silence on these issues, alongside that of other Democrats, such as Representative Rick Larsen, Representative Pramila Jayapal, and Senator Patty Murray, has been deafening. Where is your voice in calling out your fellow Democrats for supporting or enabling harmful policies such as the Laken Riley Act, which prioritizes corporate interests over immigrant families and workers? Where is your leadership in challenging unions like the Teamsters, who have betrayed the very workers they claim to represent by aligning with Donald Trump's regressive labor agenda? Your speech made reference to Dolores Huerta, but it is worth remembering that Dolores stood with laborers, immigrants, and workers, fighting for their collective rights. She did not remain silent in the face of injustice or political expediency. Neither should you. Your silence on the American Families United Act, a vital piece of legislation addressing the unification of immigrant families, is a betrayal of the very values you profess to uphold. Furthermore, your unwillingness to address the class war being waged on both immigrant and labor rights shows a disconnect between your rhetoric and the action required to make meaningful change. Immigrants are not just poster children for speeches. They, along with American workers, deserve your full commitment to advocating for systemic change, not just symbolic gestures. I urge you to break this cycle of silence. Call out Representative Rick Larsen and others who have failed to support immigrant and workers' rights. Demand accountability from unions and labor organizations that are more interested in political posturing than in standing for the people they represent. Challenge harmful legislation like the Laken Riley Act and fight for comprehensive reforms like the American Families United Act. Your parents' sacrifices as immigrant farm workers deserve more than platitudes. Immigrants, workers, and their families deserve more than empty promises. As an elected representative, you have a responsibility to lead boldly, to speak out against injustice, and to ensure that all voices, especially those silenced by systemic oppression, are heard. I ask you to reflect on the words of Dolores Huerta and join us in walking the streets into history, not just standing on the sidewalk of complicity. This is your moment to rise to the challenge and prove that your commitment to immigrant and worker communities is more than just words. I look forward to your response and, more importantly, to your action. Sincerely, Darren Arfonso, a concerned citizen. Profits over people. Exposing the elite's war on immigrants and workers in a nation built on promises of liberty and justice, a silent war rages against immigrants and workers, waged by elites on both sides of the political spectrum. From Melania Trump to Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk, and Democratic leaders, the message is clear: exploitation and division serve their interests. As Republicans and Democrats blame each other, their shared inaction exposes a grim truth: a class war targeting the vulnerable for profit. Democrats, silence in the face of injustice. Democrats often claim to champion progress and equality, yet their actions betray these values. Representative Pramila Jayapal, a self-styled advocate for immigrant rights, ignored calls to support the American Families United Act for years. It took a Texas Republican to reintroduce the bill before she finally spoke up. Senators Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray also ignored repeated pleas for help, refusing to champion this critical legislation that protects U.S. citizens from unjust immigration policies. Representative Rick Larson and other Washington state Democrats were similarly silent, neglecting workers' rights and immigrant protections for nearly a decade. Adding to this betrayal, some Democrats now support border walls and the Laken Riley Act. This bill, co-sponsored by Senator John Fetterman, whose wife's immigrant story should make him an ally, mandates detention without bond for undocumented migrants accused of minor offenses. Their silence on the American Families United Act, a bill that prioritizes U.S. citizens and family unity, underscores their complicity. If Democrats genuinely cared about American families, they would champion this act with urgency. Republicans, division and profit Republicans, wield anti-immigrant rhetoric to distract from their exploitation of labor. The Laken Riley Act, a draconian measure criminalizing minor offenses to justify indefinite detention, exemplifies this agenda. Figures like Donald Trump and Elon Musk profit from immigrant labor while supporting policies that strip away protections. Their hypocrisy is glaring. They demonize the very people who underpin the economy while ensuring profits flow to the elite. The Laken Riley Act versus the American Families United Act. The contrast between these two bills reveals the priorities of our leaders. The Laken Riley Act fuels private prisons and codifies systemic racism, creating a profit-driven system that undermines basic rights. In contrast, the American Families United Act addresses the injustices faced by U.S. citizens whose families are torn apart by immigration laws. This act prioritizes justice and human dignity, yet it remains ignored by both parties. The elite's war on labor and immigrants, elites across the spectrum, profit from oppression. Private detention centers thrive on bipartisan policies, criminalizing migration and poverty. Meanwhile, laborers, both documented and undocumented, endure exploitation without basic protections. This war isn't just on immigrants. It's a war on all working people. The silence from leaders who claim to stand for justice, including Councilmember Kshama Sawant, is deafening. A call to action: we must reject this false divide of left versus right and focus on the real enemy, a system that values profit over people. Human rights are non-negotiable. The fight for immigrant rights is inseparable from the fight for workers' rights. Leaders from all parties must end their cowardice. Silence is complicity. The time to act is now. Workers and immigrants deserve dignity, protection, and equality, not exploitation and betrayal. The Great American Shell Game. How the Laken Riley Act and silent leaders betray working families in the theater of American politics. Few stories illustrate the widening gulf between the priorities of the ruling elite and the needs of ordinary Americans more starkly than the contrast between the Laken Riley Act and the American Families United Act. These legislative battles reveal a troubling pattern. Corporate profits and elite interests take precedence over the well-being of the people, all under the guise of political progress. The high cost of the Laken Riley Act. A taxpayer burden, the Laken Riley Act, passed with bipartisan support, has been marketed as a measure to enhance national security. However, a closer examination paints a different picture. The act mandates detention for undocumented individuals accused of specific nonviolent crimes, significantly expanding the role of private detention centers. This expansion is expected to cost taxpayers $850 billion over the next decade, covering new detention facilities, additional personnel, and operational resources. Meanwhile, private prison corporations, such as Geo Group and CoreCivic, are reaping enormous financial gains. Their stock prices have soared, Geo Group by 74% and CoreCivic by 55% since the Act's passage, revealing the act as a financial windfall for these companies at public expense. The Laken Riley Act exemplifies how policy can be weaponized for profit, prioritizing corporate greed over justice and fiscal responsibility. The forgotten promise of the American Families United Act in sharp contrast. The American Families United Act, which seeks to preserve family unity by offering discretionary relief for mixed-status families, has languished in Congress. This vital legislation addresses the growing humanitarian crisis caused by family separations, proposing long-term solutions to keep families together. Unlike the Laken Riley Act, which found quick traction in Congress, the American Families United Act has faced near-total neglect. Despite its potential to generate $1.5 trillion in economic benefits through increased stability and workforce participation, the bill has been stalled for years. Advocates point to the lack of political will as a glaring failure of leadership, particularly among those who champion themselves as defenders of immigrants and working families. A shell game played by the elite. The stark difference in how these two legislative efforts have been treated is not coincidental. It reflects a broader pattern of political gamesmanship. This shell game pits the interests of working families against a top-heavy system that rewards the elite. Key players in this game include Democratic stalwarts like Rep. Rick Larson and Rep. Pramila Jayapal, and even so-called progressive figures like Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Rep. Rick Larson voted in favor of the Laken Riley Act, aligning with private prison interests despite claims to champion progressive values. Rep. Pramila Jayapal, a vocal advocate for immigrant rights, has been conspicuously silent on both the plight of federal workers and the American Families United Act for the past 8 years. Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, hailed as a leader of the progressive left, has similarly been silent on the critical issues of workers' rights and federal protections for injured workers. Her recent criticisms of the Laken Riley Act feel like a case of being a day late and a dollar short, a performative gesture rather than meaningful action after 8 years of inaction. Similarly, figures like Dr. Jill Stein of the Green Party and Seattle socialist Kshama Sawant, who have built their platforms on promises of systemic change, have failed to address the erosion of workers' rights or fight for a National Workers' Compensation Commission. This bipartisan failure highlights a troubling reality. Both major parties and third-party figures are complicit in perpetuating a top-down system that prioritizes corporate profits and elite interests over meaningful reform. A class war disguised as bipartisanship at its core, this isn't just about policy, it's about power. The Laken Riley Act, with its staggering costs, profits the elite while ordinary taxpayers foot the bill. Meanwhile, the American Families United Act, with its potential to empower millions of American families, remains sidelined. This dynamic is emblematic of a broader top versus bottom class, war disguised as bipartisan cooperation. Both sides of the aisle, along with their so-called progressive allies, have mastered the art of appearing to fight for justice while enabling systems of inequality to persist. Calling foul. Time to demand accountability. The silence and complicity of political leaders must not go unnoticed. For 8 years, calls for amnesty, comprehensive immigration reform, and a National Workers' Compensation Commission have gone unanswered. Now, as elites profit from the chaos, we see once again how the game is rigged. The American people deserve better. It's time to call foul on this shell game and demand accountability from leaders who have betrayed the very people they claim to serve. Grassroots movements must amplify their voices, expose these injustices, and push for policies that prioritize people over profits. Conclusion. Exposing the truth, the Laken Riley Act and the neglect of the American Families United Act are not isolated incidents. They are part of a systemic problem. By shining a light on these injustices, we can begin to dismantle the elite-driven system that perpetuates inequality and prioritize policies that serve the working class. This is not just a political battle. It's a fight for the soul of the nation.